First of all, one thing I want to say is that, and I find remarkable, Maria, is that you this is not your native tongue that you write in.
No, that's true.
I mean, Nabokov and you came from Russia, spoke Russian. You didn't speak English till you were how old?
Six-ish, 6, 7.
Yeah. I find that to be remarkable, and something that you rarely mention in either of your either of your books.
Listen, if it gets me in the same sentence as Nabokov, I will mention it all the time.
Yeah, you should. I think you should. But I want to start. When we first met and started talking about this, we talked about David Marr's book, The Big Con.
Yep.
Which led me to think about David Mamet, who's owes a lot to David Marr. The Big Con. Mm-hmm. You want to talk about what The Big Con is for a second, and how you stumbled upon that book?
Sure. So David Marr is a linguist, and he was someone who was totally fascinated by the subculture of con artists and spent years on the streets with them, learning their language and kind of figuring out how they think, because you realize that the language of the con is kind of a window, not just into the thought process, but into the entire thing. And his book is just, I think it's still the best book about con artists that's ever been written.
Well, yeah, what I was going to say is that The Big Con is this towering achievement. If you haven't read that book, after you buy Maria's book, you have to buy the Big Con, because inside that book is are the tools and techniques for every con you've ever seen in any movie you've watched, from The Sting to House of Games, and Moore tried to explain how con artists think. But he didn't explain so much how the victims of cons think.
No.
And I'm wondering if part of what you were thinking about was this giant opus that really, anyone writing about this goes back to that book, left this big piece out. Is that part of what sparked your curiosity?
It absolutely is, especially since the immediate impetus for the book was actually House of Games, David Mamet's film, because I remember watching it and I really identified with Lindsay Krause's character because, she's a psychology PhD, just finished a best-selling book. I was like, this seems a little bit familiar. And the fact that Mamet picked her as his kind of victim, and she's such a sophisticated woman, and you'd think that if anyone knows about the psychology of con artists, it would be someone who's a psychologist, who sees patients, who actually understand how this works, and yet no one had actually done anything about that aspect of it.
Right, and you talk about in the book how smart people often think they can't fall prey to this, but of course, in many ways, they're set up the best to. How did you figure that out, and was that a surprising thing?
It was really surprising. I started off researching with a very, I was feeling pretty smug about myself, in the sense that I thought, I'm going to research this for other people because I'm not a possible victim.
Yeah.
And I realized that so many victims are not just really, really smart, but skeptical. They're not people who just would fall for anything. They're not gullible. They're certainly not greedy. They're not dishonest. None of these things that you normally think of as a victim.
Right, you say in the book that the old saw that you can't con an honest person is false.
Absolutely false.
So how did you prove to yourself that that was false?
I spent a number of years talking to victims and talking to con artists and actually going through these stories and trying to figure out, well, who are the victims? What kind of people are they? And I found that a lot of times the reason they fell for it wasn't greed or dishonesty, but some sort of emotional need. I mean, if you look at romance frauds, for instance, how in the world do you explain that away by saying, oh, they're motivated by greed?
Right, but that doesn't speak to intellect at all.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. But intellect, so we have, you have very smart people who fall for Ponzi schemes all the time. Because when, I think that we are able to say objectively, if it seems too good to be true, it is. But when it happens to us, we don't think it's too good to be true. We think we're getting just what we deserve.
Well, so much of the book is about the lies we tell ourselves to convince ourselves that the too good to be true thing is actually true. And I wonder, as a psychologist, whether that surprised you, and how you explain it. And there's a quote in the book about Americans would rather be liked than right? And
Yes.
who said that?
That was Ferdinand Waldo de Mara, who's the great imposter. There was a book written about him in a movie starring Tony Curtis, right, in 1959. And he was the serial imposter who makes Frank Abagnale, the star of Catch Me If You Can, look like an amateur just because of how long and how deeply
Leo
he operated.
DiCaprio was the star.
Yes.
Abagnale was the protagonist.
Yes,
Yeah.
Abagnale was the protagonist. So he makes him look kind of amateurish just because of the scope of what he was able to accomplish and how long he worked. I mean, this guy was exposed over and over and ended up working for decades. And he said this to explain why he was able to find willing victims everywhere, because people want to be liked, especially in the U.S. I was surprised there's not a lot of cross-cultural data on this. I would have loved to see that, to see if this type of approach would work in other
in the
countries.
book, I mean, you seem to talk about it as a particularly American phenomenon.
I think that's right, because Americans really do have, I think it's part of the ethos of the country, of this exceptionalism, American exceptionalism. We've always thought of ourselves as great, and we instill this into young children from, I think, a very young age, that we're special, that we're unique individuals, that we deserve all good things.
But at the same time, there's this romance. So we're talking about Maurer and Mamet. You said Mamet's movie is what made you first spark to this. Mamet's movie, although it ends, if you haven't seen it, it's kind of a brutal ending. But it does celebrate the romantic aspect of this life, and that movie absolutely is one of the 4 or 5 cornerstone movies that made me want to do the thing that I do also. But I was thinking about Mamet, and I found this Mamet quote in Writing in Restaurants, his first book of essays. And he says, he's talking about, in this essay, pool halls, he's talking about how the grifter kind of America has disappeared. And he says, well, I guess that America's gone. We no longer revere skill and the short con of the pool hustle and the Murphy man and the Fuller Brush man. The short con, which flourished in a life lived on the street and among strangers, has been supplanted by the big con of a life with no excitement in it at all. And I'm wondering where you think the romantic notion of a life being better with con artists walking among us and hustling us at the pool table and running insurance scams and betting scams is better. Like, why do you think we need that kind of excitement, and we find these people romantic enough that, you call your book The Confidence Game. You're also playing upon our romance and fascination with people who pull this stuff off. That's the Trojan horse that gets us in to the book. That's what gets us in.
That's absolutely right. And I actually made a conscious choice to do that, because I could have written just about the victims and it would have been a very different book. It would have been a very depressing book. And I think that part of it is, I think we're fascinated by criminals, but con artists, they're usually not violent criminals. They're not usually, I say, because you have instances like Mamet's film, but it's an exercise in soft skills, so we can really respect it. We say, hey, well, Bernie Madoff never stole from anyone. People willingly gave him money to invest, and they tried to give it to him, and he wouldn't take their investments. He built up this exclusivity to get people to finally, give him money. And I think that's part of it. And I think the other part of it is that we think we're on the outside looking in. We don't think we're possible victims, and so we can romanticize it.
But I want to go deeper into this idea of not really considering them criminals. That's actually the next thing that I'd written down to ask you about, because I'm trying to figure it out too. Is it because we view them as people who use their wits to survive, as people honest enough to admit they're fleecing you? But what is it about that that's particularly American? Because also in your book you point out the difference between Russians and Americans. You say Russians assume. I mean, you point out how many times in 10 minutes, in an average 10-minute conversation, do Americans lie? About 3 times. In every conversation. Everyone's looking at me like, not me. I don't. And definitely to the person they're with. Hour per minute. For 10 minutes. For 10 minutes. Yeah, and we're not talking about egregious lies. It's
something like "How are you?" is actually a lie, because if you don't actually care how that person is doing, and if you say, "Oh, I'm doing great," and you're not really doing great, so you have to count. When you start counting the little white lies, that number starts going inching up very, very quickly.
And yet we don't consider ourselves.
No, absolutely not. I think we would all say that we were totally honest. I gave a talk a few years ago about cheating, and I talked about lying, and I asked the audience, how many of you can honestly say you don't lie? One person insisted on raising his hand and say, no, I've never lied in my life.
But you talk about the social utility of lying too.
Absolutely.
And you say that in Russia it's expected and known if you're talking to somebody that you're lying. It's not, you're not committing any sort of a social violation, right?
Absolutely not. I mean, plagiarists, it's not really plagiarism. That's the way you write your dissertation.
So I
find the right thesis.
Man, I love an audience that laughs at a dissertation joke. That's really awesome. We're definitely in New York. But I was comparing your book as I was reading it with Sam Harris's book Lying. And, in that book, he tries to get the reader to go a week without lying. And I don't know if anybody's tried it, but it seems like the kind of thing that you could absolutely do. I tried to do it, and I didn't last a week. I think I lasted 3 days without even telling a white lie. But it's incredibly difficult, and the book forces you to think about the social utility of lying. But writing the book must have made you really think about that.
Absolutely.
So as you were writing it and researching it and then noticing yourself lying, what did you know, right? Because you would. What did you learn about yourself in this process and about why we play with the truth?
I mean, at some point I was like, I'm also a terrible human being.
Right.
because you don't even think about it. And sometimes, you feel like it's easier to lie than to tell the truth. Like, for instance, if I have a lot going on and I have a dinner plan with someone who I really don't want to see because there's just too much going on and I really want to cancel, I might make something up, like say, I'm really not feeling well. Could we reschedule? Rather than say, I don't really feel like seeing you tonight. Could we reschedule? And you justify it by saying, I'm sparing their feelings. I'm not being rude. I'm not saying, hey, you know what, guys, I'm not going to come to your wedding because I don't particularly want to. You're saying I have a very horrible conflict. I'm out of town. So we lie for those reasons. But I also noticed that I sometimes just do it because it's easy.
Do you think part of the allure about con people, because con men is what we all say, but I thought it was really fascinating how many of the people in your book, con men, were women.
Yes, I did that on purpose.
I know, clearly. But do you think that that part of why we like con artists is that they don't lie to themselves about what they are?
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think that might be part of it, because they really are honest in the sense of being dishonest. Like that's how they make a living, and they say, I love this. Some of the people I interviewed, they were just practically gleeful. They were so proud of what they did.
What's an example of that?
So this guy, Ken Perenni, who was an art forger, and he now lives in Florida. He's a retired art forger. So he makes his living. He still paints forgeries, but he doesn't sign them. So they're legitimate forgeries. He's allowed to sell these things. Part of me thinks that he might still be forging on the side, but that's a different story.
As you were saying, he's retired. I was like, no, he's not retired.
Yeah, I actually think he's probably still operating. But so when we talked, he said, you know what? I am a brilliant artist, and my paintings grace the covers of Christie's and Sotheby's catalogs. And you know what? The people who bought them, suckers, they deserve my paintings because I'm just as good, and if you can't tell the difference, then it's your fault. And I love what I do. I'm talented at what I do. I don't feel guilty for a second. In fact, this is the love of my life. And there were lots of people like that who were just ridiculously proud and thought that they're con artists. They're artisans. They really do think of themselves as craftsmen.
Were they aware of how they were coming off to you? Did you allow them to see any judgment from you?
No, I just let them talk. I just kind of, I like to fade into the background because they love to talk. They're quite narcissistic. And so once you get them going, I think I couldn't get a word in edgewise. If you listen to the recordings of my conversations with some of them, I think I speak maybe once in 2 hours or twice. And they're very self-perpetuating.
Well, I was wondering also about, the Joan Didion line that writers are always selling someone out, and which is to say that writers are often con artists themselves.
Absolutely.
And so do you ever feel in reporting your stories for the New Yorker or that you're employing and deploying some of these? I guess you do. Yeah,
I do. And when I was researching some of the techniques, at some point I bowed my head and say, oh my God, I do this. I've done
What's
this in the past. So some of them are persuasive tactics, right? How do you get people emotionally involved? How do you open a story? How do you get people to want to read? How do you get them empathetically engaged? How do you get them to really want to see how the story goes? And that's what con artists think all the time. They're thinking, who's my audience? How do I hook them? Because I'm trying to sell them a story. And when I'm writing, I'm not trying to lie, but I am trying to tell a story. And I'm thinking, what's the most effective way to do this? How do I get people emotionally engaged in this? How do I get them to believe me and to come along with me on this journey? And that's the exact same process that a con artist goes through.
And then what about when you're dealing with sources and trying to enlist them as well? Did researching this make you, first, did it teach you anything about how to do that stuff? Because you talk about the ways in which we, some of us have the capacity to notice things, but sometimes we turn it off almost on purpose. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about whether your ability to recognize the signs of lying or misdirection became sharper, and if you were able to hold on to it, and if that made life more difficult for you or easier for you?
Well, I think I realized how bad I am at it, and I think that everyone is pretty bad at seeing signs of misdirection, but I did become better at seeing when people were trying to employ some of these persuasive tactics on me or trying to kind of manipulate me.
Salespeople? Or
Well, interview subjects sometimes. They are also, they try to sell you a very specific version of the truth. They want you to see them a certain way. They want you to present them in a certain light. And so they will be very selective with what they tell you and how they tell it to you. And it takes, you have to really talk to them for a long time and really try your best interview techniques. I'm sure you've had this happen too when you were interviewing people in the hedge fund business. So Brian has a wonderful new show out called Billions. You should all watch it. It's about the hedge fund industry. But I'm sure you came across that too, where they try to sell you a very specific version of their world. They want you to see it in a certain light. They don't want you to see a lot of the negative stuff about it. And so I became much more sensitive to that. I also became more sensitive to when I tried to do the same thing, because you want people to open up to you. So you guys are both trying to con each other in a sense, because you want your sources to tell you what they don't want to tell you.
But I guess the con artists, you break out these three characteristics, and right at the beginning of the book, but I thought it was something that kept coming up throughout. You talk about how people ask whether they're psychopaths, but often ignore narcissist and Machiavellian. And the psychological term everyone here knows about Machiavelli and about people who act and do things that seem Machiavellian. But can you talk about the type and what that really means in a person, and why that sets them up well to be a con artist?
Sure. So Machiavellianism is this ability to use the tools of persuasion for your own ends, so that the people who you're persuading don't even realize that they're doing something you want them to do and not something that they legitimately want to do themselves. And you find time and time again that people who are high on so-called Machiavellianism end up winning debates. They come out on top in almost any argument, in almost any situation where there's any sort of deception, because they don't let emotions kind of get in the way of their persuasive pitch. I'm
thinking of half the people at the Republican debate.
So this is something that, I think this is something that con artists, almost by definition, have to be good at, to try to get you kind of to think that you're doing what you want to be doing.
I'm kind of researching right now people who sort of are a sliver of a group of people who actually kind of publicly admitted to having done something they regret, and it's for film trying to, instead of shaming them, present a positive portrayal that there is a life after this mistake. And I'm kind of curious, do you in the book also profile the people who maybe weren't at it but kind of turned themselves in, and what usually you find brought that about? Like, was it a literal or figurative come to Jesus, or was it what does
one of my favorite things in the book is about this person she was talking about a second ago and his biographer. And this person had to come to Jesus like 4 different times, and the biographer kept believing him over and over, and it was never real.
Yep.
Because people who are these 3 things don't.
No, they don't.
They are unregenerate. They don't tend to.
No.
And that doesn't mean someone who is on a team of people conning someone could have a genuine crisis of conscience and change. But if somebody's living in this life.
Yeah. I honestly don't think they could. And this guy, Damara, I mean, his poor biographer, if you look at their relationship over a number of decades, I mean, first Damara stole his identity and impersonated him. Then he sued him. Then he sued Random House. Then he sued the film studio that made The Great Imposter.
Well, and this guy Damara pretended that he was a doctor.
Yeah.
A surgeon. And this is, Maria is a great storyteller in the book. And I mean, this is movie level, this part.
It is.
So that was this big con. This guy Damara was a battlefield surgeon who had never gone to medical school.
He hadn't finished high school.
And he convinced people that he could be a battlefield surgeon. And the biographer knew this and knew that he could not, and it was not a medical person at all, and had somehow then become convinced
that it was going to be a really great idea if he delivered his pregnant wife's baby. This is his biographer,
who was a real person of letters and had written many books. And so the answer is
yeah, they'll keep taking advantage of you. So this guy, after suing him, so the biographer keeps believing in him, keeps writing him recommendations, buys him a car, pays for his education to a religious seminary so that he could actually become a religious leader, which is what he says he always wants to do. And this guy always ends up going back to impostering, stealing, running away, just screwing him over completely. And each time he says, no, I think he's really just a person with a good soul.
Well, I was struck again and again in each story by how often certain tools that seem basic and that we all believe that we're immune to worked, like just simply flattery and claiming a sense of simpatico. So and I was thinking, I don't know if people have read this story that a bunch of people in the media were taken in very recently, 2 days ago.
Yeah, by a woman who was catfishing.
Do you know this? People know this story? This woman who pretended she was a Politico reporter?
Yeah, and she friended a lot of journalists. And so when I saw this story break, one of the things I say is never accept Facebook requests from someone you don't know. That's a very basic thing you can do to protect yourself. But so I checked my Facebook friend requests, and there she was. And not only was she there, but do you want to guess how many friends we had in common by that point? 80.
There you go.
So that means that 80 of my journalist friends had accepted her.
And what happened is, so it was a combination of social proof that she had, because once she got a couple of these people, but you would think that these are reporters. I mean, most of the people she was friending are reporters.
Yeah. In
the media, people who would laugh at this biographer. And so why do you think... in thinking about that story and watching how people were even joking about this on Twitter, that people started to feel bad if they weren't asked to be her friend because then they felt they were left out. Their status was dinged somehow. But why do you think that this kind of flattery continues to work, especially on people who would say that it can't? Like, how are we hardwired, and why is there social utility to it?
Well, I think we all see ourselves as exceptional. I mean, we're the protagonist of our own life, and we can't help but see the world from our own perspective. And so we love it when other people acknowledge our exceptionality. Flattery really does get you everywhere. And it starts with the most basic thing, remembering someone's name. So this is a technique that con artists use use all the time. They'll say, "Hey, Brian," even if they've never met you before, and then they can make up an entire story. Americans want to be liked more than they want to be right, and so you'll say, "Oh, of course, yes, of course." You don't want to be rude. You'll remember them, quote unquote, and you'll like them because they remembered your name. They kind of.
Well, you talk about and I think it's an interesting thing. I had never thought of it in this way. Why don't you talk a little bit about how just having seen somebody, and how that comes out of nature. You want to?
Yeah. So we are really wired for. Familiarity, liking based on familiarity. And this is something that people have found in animals. So for instance, among ravens, if they have a new object, then they're very scared of it. If they've never seen it before, they shy away from it. And then once they're used to it, they'll explore it, they'll be curious, and they'll start liking it finally. They'll be attracted to it. And this famous psychologist, Robert Zients, found that in humans, there's something called the mere exposure effect. So merely being exposed to something makes you like it more. So that's why you like songs better the second time you hear them. That's why you like people better the second time you see their face. And it's even if you'd have no conscious memory of the initial exposure, that repeat exposure, you become familiar with it. He has this hilarious story of a guy who was wearing a black bag and went to seminar the whole time covered in a paper bag so that no one saw his face. And at first people thought he was really, really weird. And then by the end of the seminar, they were so incredibly used to him that they really liked him. They called him the paper bag guy. And he was kind of their buddy. They wrote a newspaper piece about him. This was all part of a social psych experiment. Social psychologists are weird, and so they ended up really liking this person, and they didn't know him. They thought he was a really good guy.
How do these con artists? How do the techniques pass from generation to generation? How do people learn to exploit these weaknesses, especially in an age where the ability to defend against them is presented and is out there, and very little research tells you techniques that you should deploy, right? So how do these techniques sort of perpetuate?
Well, most con artists, I mean, some of the ones we've talked about do work alone, but a lot of them work in groups. As you know from your research into Ocean's 13, there are big groups of con artists, and there are mentorships. People do train up so that you learn kind of from the older and wiser people, and everyone becomes subspecialized, and you kind of see how all the techniques work. And then a lot of it is just from being a really good observer of human nature. So one thing, Victor Lustig, who is a very famous con artist, he's the Count who ended up selling the Eiffel Tower 2 times to different groups of people, both of whom were convinced that they had actually bought part of an interest in the Eiffel Tower for scrap metal. That's how good he was. But he had commandments of con artists. And one of the commandments is that a con artist isn't a good talker, he's a good listener. And that is key, because most people aren't good listeners. They ask you a question and they're not really listening to the answer, because they're wondering about what, they're more interested in what they're going to say.
Or in what you think of them.
Right, or in what you think of them.
Being judged, right?
Exactly. So I think some of it is passed down, but some of it is this kind of, you're an intuitive psychologist, and you're someone who ends up, I think, learning from other people and really seeing what you can learn from being a good listener and from seeing how you can exploit that.
Well, I was just wondering if you could, on that same note, I would imagine some of the longer cons, or especially the romantically related cons, you have to develop so much empathy for the person that you're conning. So how does that square with the contempt, I guess, you also have to be able to be continually ripping them off?
There was only like one moment in the book, right, where you talk about somebody letting someone off the hook out of emotion.
Yeah, it was a very famous scam that I'm actually betting that there's at least one person in the room on whom this has been attempted. It's an IRS scam when someone calls you and says that you're late with IRS payments and that you owe the IRS some money. This one is very common. Has anyone ever been approached? Yeah. All right. There we go.
Did you fall for it?
Good job.
Good.
And people get really emotionally riled up because the government's after you, so even really smart people end up giving money for this IRS scam. And so this one woman started crying and said, I'm 9 months pregnant, I'm going to lose my job. How is this going to work? And she was devastated. And the guy at the end couldn't take it and said, don't worry, lady, it's a scam. But that's very rare. And normally, there's one con artist who I quote in the book who says, the moment you feel anything for your victims, you're dead in the water. Because the empathy that you develop is a very cold and rational empathy, not an emotional empathy. You can actually separate those two out. You don't have to have any emotional rapport with someone to be able to see the world from their point of view and to really kind of understand them in a cognitive kind of cold way. And so I think that's the kind of empathy that they have. I don't actually think that most of them feel anything. If they do, they're a very bad con artist. They'll end up like this guy who didn't make any money off this woman.
There's a very crude but apt David Mamet quote, which is, the madam says to the hooker, when you start coming with the customers, it's time to go home. So that is Mr. Mamet's view on
some people just got it.
They just got it now? All right, good. Go home, get out of the racket of being a hooker. So
Does they have lack of empathy, but they're great listeners? Like, how does that kind of work? How do they understand their target and how do they...
Did people hear that question? No. It's about the duality of how can you be, on the one hand, a really good listener, and on the other hand, lack empathy and be willing to do this to other people.
Yeah, I think that we tend to conflate empathy and emotional rapport. Those are two different things. I think empathy can be divided into two elements. There's emotional empathy, and there's also a very cognitive, cold empathy, which means I understand where you're coming from, and I can actually really empathize. I can see the world from your perspective. And emotion actually can get in the way of that because you can't really see where someone else is coming from because your own emotions get in the way. So con artists, in a way, are even better at understanding where others are coming from because they turn off the emotion. And so they no longer have anything that's standing in the way of that rational understanding.
Talk a little more, please, about that. This is another thing the book is really full of insights that as soon as you read them, make total sense, but you haven't thought of before, or at least I hadn't. Talk a little bit more about the cognitive bias we have where we want to assume others think the way we do, and how that gets in the way of being able to, whereas the con artists don't. Yeah. So they're looking at you and trying to really figure out what matters to you. Most of us who aren't psychopaths, and you use that term in the book a lot, assume that you're feeling and seeing the world the way that I am. So can you elaborate on that a bit?
Absolutely. So we operate from an egocentric bias. So that means that even when we try to see the world from someone else's perspective, to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, there's so many cliches about this that we use all the time because we think it's an important skill to have, and yet so time and time again, psychologists find that we are unable to do it. So our egocentric anchor, is way too strong, and so we think that we adjust for it, but we end up never adjusting enough. And so if you're sad, you assume that other people, if something bad happened in your life, you assume that bad things are happening to other people. If you're very happy, then you get mad at people who are sad because...
Yeah, they're listening. The criminals that I've interviewed for the movies, one way I would describe it is they're listening the way you might look at a map. You don't have to have empathy to study a map. You just have to want to get where the map is showing that you can go. And so what we as humans, we're thinking about a whole bunch of other stuff and feeling a bunch of stuff. They've cleared that out. And so they're just applying rigor and intellect to it. And they're almost not even looking at you like a human that they can see and feel and have to interact with.
Yeah, they're not using themselves as a model.
Who's that? Machiavellians have less egocentric bias?
And
psychopaths. Yeah.
Is that fair to say in that point that to them, humans are basically equations?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they do not see their marks as victims. That's why the name is Mark, not victim. They don't say, I'm going to go target my victim. They say it's a mark, it's a target. So you don't see them, you see them as conquests. You don't see them as human beings.
But I was thinking about it as I was reading about this in the book. I mean, I was thinking about being on the other side of it, being interviewed. Not like this, but being interviewed by a journalist for a kind of a story. And in that setting, they're listening, they're acting as though they're really engaged in your story. They're taking the ride with you. Oh, I'm sure it was difficult, or this moment must have been hard. And then suddenly in the middle of it, I'm in the movie thing, so they'll go like, has Harvey Weinstein ever done anything bad to you? And, all they want is a story that they can then put in the paper. They're completely willing to sell you out. Now, they're not thinking of it necessarily.
Has he?
Right. And do you know how close we are to Maria Weinstein's offices here? No, I have to. No, but the point of being, no, he's been very good to me. But of course, but the point being that we're engaged, and your book does an incredible job of showing this. On a micro level, we're engaged in these things all the time, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we are always engaged in minor deceptions, in minor acts of belief, in minor self-deceptions. I mean, I think that I don't think we can have a single interaction that doesn't have a little bit of that in it, a little bit of that, I'm sure I'm going to really say, I feel terrible for, you really kind of pretend to be engaged.
And these people, and if you're picturing a con artist now as being sort of like a Joe Mantegna character in a Mamet film, could you talk about Aunt Nancy a little bit?
So Aunt Nancy was this brilliant con artist who, what she would do...
You do seem like you have affection for these people.
Yeah. I know. I have to catch myself in interviews, especially in live interviews, when I'm like, oh, this guy's so cool. He's terrible. A lot of people suffered. There were a lot of bad things that happened. But they're really fascinating characters. And when you get to know them, they're very charismatic. And so, but they're very bad human beings. I don't actually have affection for them. I just have some amount of affection that a writer has for her subject. And when you realize that it's a gift that keeps on giving. So Aunt Nancy, what she would do is she would look at wedding announcements in newspapers. So, Mr. and Mrs. Smith announced the wedding of their daughter Sarah, the engagement of their daughter Sarah to Brian. And what she would do is then go to the family and call them, and this was back in the day, so no cell phones. She'd call them and say, "Hi, I'm Aunt Nancy from California." This particular story took place in Massachusetts, and the wedding was going to be in California. I'm Sarah's aunt, and I'm just here for the day, and I'd love to catch up and see you. And of course, the family would be like, "Oh my God, Aunt, of course." And so then, she'd spend the day with them. They'd take her out to lunch. Then she would be driven back to the bus station. Of course, she'd forgotten any cash. She only had traveler's checks, so they'd give her a bus ticket. They'd buy it for her. They'd give her some cash for the road. Of course, she'd return it. I mean, she's Aunt Nancy. And then the parents obviously call Sarah and say, "Why didn't you tell us that your Aunt Nancy was coming to visit?" And Sarah would say, "I don't know who Aunt Nancy is. Let me ask my mom." So she'd call her mom, and her mom said, "I don't know. Let me ask my mom." So she called her mom. Aunt Nancy never existed. This is a woman who's totally random and who infiltrates families this way, and nobody ever says no because she's Aunt Nancy.
And is able to, under this guise, make you want to please her.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They had a lovely lunch.
So if this book serves one incredible function, huge social utility, it's to really firmly articulate why and how psychics are all frauds. So who in this room believes there's like, oh, they're mostly frauds, but there's one, this one is really good? Does anyone? Right. So there's a few of you. That's unbelievable. There are a couple of books. Read her. You need her book desperately. and desperately. And there's a book called the what's that? Do you know the name of that British book? The Full Facts Case of Cold Reading. Do you know those?
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
There's
yeah.
a British book too that I'll tweet out the name of later. That's incredible. It actually gives you every single technique, so that if you go to a psychic, you can measure it. This guy did a book that really runs you through every single way they make you believe that they're telling the truth. And I've given that book to people who tell me, yes, a psychic did exactly that to me, but this one was real. And
everyone's the exception.
those are the people I asked to invest in my movies. But so that's my little screening test. Yeah, exactly right. So, but can you talk about why we want to believe in psychics? There's a big section of the book devoted to this, and they come off the worst in a way because people go to them, it seems, at rather vulnerable moments
Absolutely.
in the Mark's life. So that whereas many of the con artists, they're doing what they do and they'll do it to whomever they find, the psychic is waiting for somebody to walk in a particularly acute emotional state.
Yeah, and it's almost, it's the psychic is kind of the person of last resort, where something really tragic has happened. So I spoke with some people who, they lost a son, they lost someone very close to them, they're going through a divorce, their life is in total upheaval, and they say, why not? It can't hurt. That's what they all say, that they go in saying it can't hurt. Well, it can hurt because you're in such a vulnerable state that these psychics are going to convince you that they are the exception because they're so good.
Are they convincing you? I was thinking about Daniel Kahneman when I was reading your book and anchoring, and the way in which we anchor beliefs, right? And I'm wondering how much of the work we do ahead of time.
I think we do a lot of the work ahead of time, and they're also very good at trying to figure out who the most vulnerable people are and what their vulnerabilities are. So we come in, we're kind of, even if we're skeptical, we're primed to think that something might come out of it, because if we really thought that there was nothing there, you would never go. And so you just go, you say, oh, it can't hurt, what's one more thing? And they really latch onto that and end up telling you things that you think they have no way of knowing. Of course, they have lots of way of knowing them. So this is what the cold read does. It makes people think that they're actually telling you something real. And they end up, very smart people end up really emotionally involved. And some of these people, they're not just smart, they're Wall Street investors. They're people who deal with, people who are out to get you every single day. You'd think they'd be a little bit more skeptical, and yet psychics continue to operate all the time. One of my favorite stories was about Harry Houdini, who actually tried mentalism, realized that he couldn't do it in good conscience, because even when he told people, guys, I'm a magician, this is all a trick, they would say, but there must be something to it, right? They wouldn't believe him even when he showed them exactly how he did this. And there's this one scene after he quit mentalism and devoted the rest of his career to trying to prove that psychics were all fakes. And so he's in the car with Sarah Bernhardt, who's gone to one of his performances, and she was one of the great actresses of the 20th century, and she didn't have a leg. One of her legs was missing. And so they're sitting in the car, and she asks him if he could bring back her leg. And he says, Sarah, that's impossible. I'm a magician. And she looks at him and says, but you do the impossible.
We want to believe it.
We want to believe it.
Go ahead.
So I'm a mentalist, so I think there's an interesting aspect to this conversation also that I find is, as much as I find that, and I play that line on purpose between what's real and what's not real, and as much as I find that some people want to believe that it's real, there's the same quality of unexamined conclusions about being a skeptic as well. So it's kind of an interesting, and then the people that intrigue me the most are the ones who have a kind of openness and curiosity, and they're really trying to find...
Sir, when you say you're a mentalist, what do you mean? You're a magician, or you're saying you're a psychic?
I'm a performer.
Are you claiming psychic powers?
No.
Okay, I just wanted to be clear, because there's $1 million if you can prove you're a psychic. Penn Jillette and the Amazing Randy have it set up that if you can prove it, there's more than $1 million now set up for that.
Yeah, no, I'm not, that's not the point. But what I'm saying is, see, like for instance, even with this conclusion about that all psychics are fraud, there's a certain certainty to it
Yes,
that,
from a life of study. From a life of rigorous study.
no, I understand, but this is also.
We'll do this later. Let's ask questions. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you for the book. I look forward to reading it, and I was wondering if you saw any parallels in the way that this con artists were brought up, or if they had any sort of psychological, obviously, that something is off, but if they had certain, something nature versus nurture that was consistent across all of
Oh, this is like my favorite quote that you repeat about the loading the gun.
Oh
and
yeah.
firing the gun.
So the quote that I will now quote back to you is that, and it's not my quote. I'm quoting other scientists. Is that nature, that genes load the gun, but the environment is what pulls the trigger. And I think that that's the answer to absolutely every single one of these sorts of questions. That yes, there's some sort of predisposition, but there's nothing that's going to sit. There's no sort of causality that says you will become a con artist. It's all about what ends up happening in your life. And yes, in the exact same circumstances, some people will become con artists and others won't. But there are some people who might go through an entire life without ever being put in a situation that brings their con artist out, and they end up actually being just fine and being very kind of productive members of society, whereas others aren't so lucky.
Usually in a room like this, there are a couple of writers. So can you just talk a little bit about process, and we'll go to questions. Can you talk a little bit about how you convince yourself every day to write, what your routine is, and how in the middle you don't want to give up, or if you do, how you keep yourself moving forward, conning yourself into believing that there's really a story to tell?
That's a really good question, and I think I probably stole this from other writers, that I have to write kind of first thing in the morning, that I feel there's nothing that makes me feel more unproductive than if I wake up and go to the computer and start checking email and go on Twitter, and then all of a sudden it's 5 hours later, and I suddenly feel like, well, there goes the day. And so I try not to have the internet even on when I first come to the computer. I have a program called Freedom that blocks the
And you
internet.
put it on in the morning?
Yeah, I sometimes do. Yeah,
Because sometimes I see you on Twitter pretty early. Josh, would you back that up? Would you agree? Yes.
So I actually I have a secret, dirty little Twitter secret. I pre-schedule tweets too, and so sometimes that's not actually me, but I do respond to you sometimes very early in the morning, and yes, I respond to Josh as well. Sorry, guys. So this is I'm talking about my ideal process.
Right.
So
yes,
sometimes
good. No, great.
sometimes it doesn't quite happen, and those end up being really frustrating, unproductive days, because I feel like if I can get something done in the morning, it puts me in a really good frame of mind for the rest of the day, and I'm then able to, take a break and then go back to writing. Because I think Hemingway is the one who said, never stop writing when you're done. Stop a little bit before.
Ernest.
Ernest,
Okay,
yeah. So stop writing a little bit before, when you still have something to say.
Juice left.
Yeah, when you still have some juice, you know exactly what you're going to say next. And so when you start in the morning, that actually gives you kind of that creative energy for the rest of the day. I also find it's really important to take breaks and to really take breaks. And I'm a big believer in the lunch break, where you actually go away from the computer.
That's
so
great.
that your mind actually has time to clear and you have time to recharge. I love to take walks. Sometimes I'll just go by myself.
Yeah, me too. That's great.
And take a walk, just because when you do that, I feel like you often, you're re-energized, your mind wanders, and you suddenly you find out that you weren't wasting time. You've been thinking.
Right.
You've been working through ideas. You've been working through difficult moments in your writing.
Absolutely. Hemingway talks about that. Hemingway on Writing is a great book about this.
Yes.
Actually, too. Questions? We'll go back to you. Someone back there who hasn't asked one?
Hi,
Yes.
just wondering, with some of these con artists who are saying kind of like emotionally void with their partners, not victims, does that translate, do they separate that like the way that a normal person would work in personal life? Or like, is it kind of an off-the-board issue where like these people can't make these work on?
That is such a good question. So the question is, do they separate it out in their professional?
Can they be sort of like a loving, caring person in their home life?
I think they can be. So I did an interview. I don't know that he realized how hilarious he was being. So I just did this interview on the radio with a guy who was a professional game fixer for his whole life. So he basically he created crooked gambling games all over the world. And he's now in his 70s. He's retired. He's written a book about this. And so we're talking, and he's talking about all the tricks he uses, how he has cold decks and all these things, and all these people he's scammed. And then I don't remember exactly what I said to prompt this, but he said, but I'm not a con artist. I'm a really good-hearted person. And I'm just a professional. I'm a gambler. And I said, sir, you're not a gambler. I mean, gamblers don't fix games. And so I think they all think that they're good people.
Good. Yeah, we'll open it up to questions now completely.
What about those in international espionage spies? Do they go home and have a separate life, people who are professionals?
I have no idea.
Maybe the next book. Good question.
Good question. I think a lot of them don't. I think a lot of them end up married to other spies.
On the flip side of that, can a con artist be con?
Oh, a lot of the book talks about that.
Yes.
There are sections that talk about
Yes,
that.
there are specific cons targeted at con artists. And by the way, since we were just talking about psychics, there's this one con artist who basically over multiple decades convinced hundreds of people of the existence of the Drake fortune, that Sir Francis Drake, the great pirate and buccaneer, had left behind this vast treasure, and that it could all be yours if you just gave a little bit of money, because it was embroiled in this bureaucratic nightmare, and finally it was going to be freed up. Long story short, this guy got conned by a psychic who ended up taking him for tens of thousands of dollars, because even though he was such a good con artist himself, he thought this particular psychic was the real deal. So he thought psychics on the whole were fake, but this one was real.
Go ahead.
I'm curious to know what you learned about ordinary people who are not con artists and are not victims. You talked about how we all lie or do small deceptions here and there, white lies. But what's the biggest con that we all do? I'm thinking, I know there's some people are somewhere in between honest people and, like people who cheat on their spouse, or people who have, like I know people who have elaborate systems for like smoking pot at work and things like that. But are there, besides the little white lies, like what are the cons that we all do?
I think that the greatest con we all do is conning ourselves to think that we're better than we actually are. I mean, we con ourselves on a daily basis. Everyone thinks that they're better than average at basically everything good, and worse than average at everything bad. And this,
you said it's an enormously useful skill.
It is. It's really
talk
useful.
about the athletes.
So there's this great study on swimmers, and they looked at basically how good are you at self-deception, and people who were better at self-deception ended up being better athletes. They performed better, and they ended up qualifying. There was actually an external measure. There isn't on a lot of these things, but here there was an outcome. Did they qualify for the national championships? And the higher you scored, the more likely you were to qualify. So it actually helps. Yes, it's a con. I mean, we're not as good as we think we are. The only people who see themselves honestly are the clinically depressed, by the way.
Am I missing anyone in the back with a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for this really stimulating conversation. I was wondering, since you're a psychology PhD, what you thought of cons within academia and psychology. People that graduate students claim that he had done a survey of gay men and turned out he had never even applied for the priming man who's in question. What drives him, and do you think that now that we're in the age where we have a website, that's the route to debunking these double
So Ivan Aransky is actually in the audience, who runs Retraction Watch, and looks at a lot of these things. But I think that what happens is there's obviously a lot of pressure, and under a lot of pressure, most people stay honest. But some people, they cut a corner and they get away with it. So it starts with something very small. That graduate student, I wrote about him when this came out. He didn't start out by fabricating an entire study. Look at his CV. There's so many false grants on it, so much false background. You start with something small, you get away with it, you realize, I can get away with it, and suddenly you're creating fake studies. It doesn't have to be a grad student. It could be Mark Hauser, who was a Harvard professor, who is no longer a Harvard professor. Stephen Glass is a journalist, but yes, within journalism, obviously that exists. But yeah, not just in psychology, but in science, I think it usually starts small because you're trying to keep up, you're trying to keep a reputation going, you're trying to create a career that you can't actually carry off on your own. And then because you're successful, you keep going.
Yeah. Have you observed similarities between politicians' persuasion techniques and con artists?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no way around it. Politicians use a lot of the same techniques as con artists. And I think David Moore is the one who points this out, that we need to be really careful when we're judging con artists because it's a matter of degree. And they're just one step removed from a lot of people we see as legitimate businessmen, as legitimate lawyers, as legitimate politicians, advertisers.
There's someone back there. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering if you see, do you feel that there are more con artist type people in society today as there was before, with the internet and with people feeling, that they're entitled to so much because they're so good?
Yeah, I don't know if there are more. I think there are more successful ones because I think people have always tried to be con artists and only the really good ones succeeded. And technology has kind of raised everyone up. So the really good ones, they're now brilliant, but ones who were mediocre and who might have kind of, I think, gone out of the game, they stay in the game longer.
And yet, even with the existence of Snopes and Retraction Watch, I mean, how many times a week do you get something patently false sent to you that some credulous person believed and forwarded on?
Absolutely.
There are all sorts of tools to counter it, but it's still
and disinformation is it's really hard to fight.
You mentioned really briefly earlier that your stories are mostly about women.
Not
there's just
mostly.
a big section about women. It's not mostly
there are women there, and usually women are absent because usually it's a con man. It's.
Why do you think that is? Because I was actually going to do a secondary question since you work in film a lot. Why are most films about con men are men? And if it's women, they're either malicious or written very carefully.
You need to see The Grifters. Angelica Houston and
so good.
John Cusack, and it's an incredible movie from 25 years ago based on a book by Jim Thompson, and it's a great book about the grift and about women grifters, and they got some nominations out of it. It's worth seeing, and it's worth reading that book, The Grifters.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the famous ones are men, and my pet theory is because the women are actually more successful, and so they don't get caught as often.
That's good, but also, and anytime that's true, anytime that there's a question about why does Hollywood make movies, whatever, that's always about what the people who finance movies believe is going to make them more money. That's really the why.
And we want to. I mean, con artists can be pretty bad people, and so you want people to empathize with them. And I think a lot of times female protagonists, if you make them too strong, it's like the Hillary Clinton problem. People don't like them. And
the movie business is often 10 years behind what people actually want. They just, but so, even though they're not all run, the studios, by men anymore, the women who are running them largely came up in these institutions that were run by men and learned to do things a certain way. But I think it's already starting to happen, but that'll all shift. You'll get your female con artists soon enough.
My next project.
It maybe also just has to do with, there's a lot of writing these days about how, whether in tech or anywhere, like women are generally less confident, even when they ought to be more confident than men, or do you think that's...
Well, I don't think that...
It takes a degree of confidence to be confident, right?
Well, I think it's a different sort of confidence. So the confidence and confidence game isn't about how confident you are. It's about me giving my confidence to you, my trust. It's confidence in that sense.
Allure of doing that.
And are the rates of psychopathy lower among women?
Oh yes, psychopaths are less than 1% of psychopaths are women. So insofar as there's an overlap there are almost no women psychopaths.
Should we do like one more question or something like that? Anyone who hasn't asked a question who wants to ask one?
Hi. I was wondering about the research that you had to do for the book, besides, asking questions to the con artists. Was there anything else that you had to do? Like, what was your extensive research? Like,
Well, so I did hundreds of hours of interviews, both with con artists and with their victims, and then I also interviewed psychologists and did a lot of work combing through the psych literature to try to explain the things that I was seeing and try to figure out, what's going on psychologically and why is this happening? How is it happening?
How can people find you on social media after whatever 11 o'clock when you're online?
Right. I'm never going to be on in the morning.
That is a lie.
Yes, that is a lie. I'm on Twitter at Konnikova. That's probably the best way. I'm also on Facebook at Maria Konnikova. And I have a website, which is mariakonnikova.com. Everything's very, very simple, very straightforward.
And you're going to do a signing. Now, you can find me at Brian Koppelman if you want to argue about whether psychics exist. We can do it with all the other people on there, too. At Brian Koppelman at Twitter. And everyone should stay and get you to sign their book and then buy the book. And what a great audience. Thanks for listening. And thank you for inviting me to have this conversation with you.
And hold on, before you clap, and thank you, Brian, so much for doing this. Brian's show just came out on Sunday, so he's taking time out of an intensely busy schedule, and everyone should watch Billions.
Yes,
it's very, very good.
Please do. Thank you. All right, thanks.